Number 1. The house. I always remember the ride to my grandma's house when I was younger. We lived in a different state than she did. The majority of the ride would be us driving on the interstate. When we got closer to the area that she lived in, we would get off the road and onto the local roads. But I always knew that we were almost to Grandma's house when we began going down the dirt road that led to her house. And I would always perk up and look out the windows to see all the sights that were there to see on that road. There were some big trees that we recognized. There was an old, decaying shed that was right up on the road. And sitting back from the road, there was a really old, decaying house sitting amongst the trees. It must have been abandoned a very long time. I mean, not only was it in an awful state, but if it had a driveway, it had long since been grown over by grass, bushes, and trees. I always asked my parents and my grandma about the house. However, no one ever really knew anything about it. It had been abandoned long before my grandma had bought her house. But they also warned me not to even think about trying to go over to the house. They didn't care if we hiked around on someone else's property, and that wasn't their concern. However, they thought that the old and abandoned house was likely to be very dangerous. That is why they wanted us to keep away from it. Well, you know children, when you tell them not to do something, that makes them really want to do it. Although for many years, we listened to our parents and did not try to go and explore the old house. But then there was this one time I was 12, and I was the only kid who was at my grandma's house. I was pretty bored that none of my cousins were there, and I really hated listening to the adults talking back then, so I told my parents that I was going to go for a walk. It was a really lovely fall day, and those were the days that I liked the most. So basically, all my mom told me to do was to wear a jacket, and I did. It was pretty cool outside, and the leaves were heavily falling from the trees. Plus, it was sort of desolate outside, since it wasn't an area in which many people lived, and thus there weren't people or cars on the road. It was a simple and peaceful fall walk. Now, I hadn't set out with any intention of going to check out that old house, and it was just by chance that I chose to walk in that direction, up the road, and not the other one. But after walking for a while, and the house came into view, I began to consider going and checking it out. I began making my way through the trees to get to the house. I was a little nervous about someone driving by and seeing me. The last thing I wanted to do was to get in trouble. If one of my aunts or uncles were driving to Grandma's house and saw me, I would have been in a whole lot of trouble when my parents found out. But I got to the house without anyone catching me, and I nervously walked around the building. I considered stepping up on the porch, but it honestly looked like it might collapse if I had tried to do that. So I decided I would walk around to the back of the house to see what it was like on the other side. It was even more overgrown back there. However, there were windows that I could look through that didn't involve me having to get on the porch. I did, however, have to get some weeds and tall grass flattened down in order for me to get up to the window. When I finally was able to get a good look into the window, I wasn't too surprised with how it looked. It seemed like I was looking into a bedroom, because there was a metal frame for an old bed inside that room. Plus, it looked like there was a dresser. Immediately I was curious of what might be in it. I moved to where there was a back door to the old house. I was wondering if I would be able to get into it through that door. However, even though it was old and decrepit, it was locked, and the door wouldn't budge. However, there was a window in the door, so I was able to see into the kitchen of the house. There was a table and some appliances in there that looked very, very old. As I was looking, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. I could have sworn that I saw something moving in one of the hallways. I shook my head in bewilderment, But even at 12 years old, I knew that your eyes could play tricks on you. So I didn't take it seriously, and I decided to move to another window. I also reconsidered trying out the front porch to see if I was able to get into the house through that door. I had already forgotten the movement that I thought I saw. I began walking toward one of the other windows, wanting to get a look into one of the other rooms. As I pulled up to the window, I almost fell over when I was looking right into the eyes of one of the oldest and gnarled-looking people that I had ever seen before. The shock sent me back so far that I fell on my butt amongst some bushes. My hands landed on some thorny vines, and they cut into my hand. Suddenly the back door opened. The really old and filthy man walked out of the house. His appearance was scary enough, but he was also carrying a hatchet in his right hand, held down at his side. He was talking to me, but I was only able to make out a few words that he had uttered. It was something along the lines of, "You stupid to try and break into my house. I cut you up good, boy." He lifted the hatchet up. Fortunately for me, he was a very, very old and frail man, and although scary, he couldn't move very fast, so I was able to get up off the ground faster than he could get to me. It hurt badly getting up because I had thorns in my hands, but I didn't pay much attention to the pain. The guy was so close to me that, if I didn't book as quickly as possible, I knew that this crazy guy was going to mess me up. I got up and I ran away from him through the woods. My goal, however, was to try and get back to the dirt road. It would be easiest to run back to my grandma's house that way. Other than for a few moments, though, it didn't seem like the old man was chasing me, so I was able to slow down once I got back to the road. Looking back at the house, I didn't see any sign of him at all. But I was still so scared about what had happened that I had to hurry my way back to Grandma's house. I didn't tell them what happened until years later. I was able to explain the cuts and stuff just from simple hiking. However, I was more scared of the possible punishment I would get for being on that property. Years later, when I was an adult and I told the story, no one really believed me. That was okay, I suppose, but the story absolutely happened, and I will never forget the way that old man looked when he came after me. Number 2. The Drive. One of the worst things to ever happen to me happened a very long time ago, but I always remember it pretty clearly. I'll get this out of the way in the beginning. Not only did it happen out in the hills, it happened before everyone had a phone on them all the time, so I wasn't able to call for help when I needed it. One of my favorite things to do was to drive over to my uncle's cabin out in the country and have a nice evening with him on Saturday. But a lot of times those visits would go really late into the night, and then I would have to drive home through the dark country roads. I couldn't sleep in anyone's bed but my own, so I couldn't spend the night over his place, and my uncle lived so far out in the hills that it took a long time getting back to the main roads. The night that this happened was one of those nights. We had been up all night having some beers and stuff, much more unthinkable now than it was back then, of course, and we had been laughing and having a great time the whole night, but the hour was getting late, and everyone else was ready to go to sleep, so even though I did feel pretty tired myself, I decided to go out for a nighttime drive home. And yeah, as I mentioned above, I was probably somewhat impaired, which made driving during the night like that even more dangerous than it actually was. You have to realize how absolutely dark it was outside. There were no lights along the dirt roads up in the hills. Plus, there were so many trees that even when there was a moon out at night, it really didn't make much of a difference. The only light source at all came from the headlights of the small little pickup truck that I was driving, and it was so concentrated in front of me that it was hard to see from the sides. The roads were also pretty dangerous. They were extremely narrow and didn't have enough room for cars going in opposite directions, There were no guardrails either, so I was driving down the road, trying to drive as careful as possible, and as slowly as I could, without running into a problem. I was putting all of my focus on driving, and making my way safely out of the hills, so I could get home and go to sleep. You had to watch carefully, because the lights didn't shine too far forward, and there were many twists and turns in the road. All it would take is one deer to jump out in front of you in order to cause a really bad accident. I was paying attention, but I really wasn't worried about anything happening. At the time that I was that old, I had never been in an accident before. As I was sort of lost in my thoughts when I rounded a corner of the hill. Once I did, two big redneck boys were standing right in front of my truck. I came upon them so suddenly that I couldn't control my reaction when I saw them. My hands on the steering wheel immediately swerved to the right to avoid hitting the two guys, and when they did, that caused my car to go right off the road and then off the side of the hill. I would love to tell you about what happened at that point, but I seriously don't recall what happened in the accident itself. I know that I swerved, but after that, I don't remember a whole lot. I can put together an image of what happened though. I mean, I obviously swerved off the side of the road in the hill, and my truck likely turned over several times when it was flopping over and over down the hill, and when that happened, it knocked me out pretty good. Everything that happened afterwards was sort of a blur though. For several times I kept coming in and out of consciousness. I thought I both saw and heard both of those redneck boys more than once, knowing afterward how far my truck had fallen down that hill. They must have made a significant effort to try and get down there to where I was. I kept hearing them talking, but I wasn't always able to make sense out of what they were saying. At times it seemed like they were discussing whether or not they thought I was dead. I wanted to say something to let them know that I wasn't dead, but I didn't seem to know how to do that. There was some talk about possibly burning the truck so there wouldn't be evidence of what had happened. That terrified me, but again, I wasn't really able to do anything about it. I couldn't move or do anything to get any of their attention. I knew that they had opened the cab of the truck at some point, and I found out later that they had taken my wallet as well, since it was never found. All I can figure out at that point is they must have figured out that I was still alive, and that must have been what convinced them against burning my truck or anything like that. But they also didn't do anything to help me, which I know for a fact. You see, after having some of those memories of them hanging around my truck at night, I recall quite clearly waking up in the hospital next, and the reason I was brought to the hospital was because my uncle had come across me in the morning, many hours after I had crashed the truck. There were no calls to the police or for an ambulance before that. I asked my uncle if the two men I had seen seemed familiar to him, but he had no idea who they might have been. As far as I know, he never found out. Although I doubt that they were deliberately in the way, and thus caused the accident, they didn't do much to help, and could have conceivably hurt, or even killed me if they had burned my truck. Number 3. The Walk. This happened to me when I was only 14 years old. It was after my parents had begun working at home, and were able then to move out to the country. They had always said that they had planned on moving out there if they could ever afford it. Both of them were raised in rural areas, but went to college and stayed in the city after they graduated. Once they were able to afford it, there had always been plans to move out to the country, though. I was an only child, so I didn't have brothers or sisters to keep me company. My parents also chose to move at the end of the school year, so I could finish up that school year before moving. While I'm happy that they did that, it also kept me from being able to make new friends at school before the summer break. We were also in an extremely rural area, and there wasn't much of an opportunity to make friends either. So a lot of that summer was just spent with me doing my own thing. It was the first time in my life that I didn't have friends, so it was rather difficult for me. And it had also been not too long after I started getting more interested in girls, and it didn't help that I would have so many thoughts about them but no contact. Although I think I might have been a lot different than a lot of guys my age. I would have these big romantic fantasies rather than just sex, sex, sex. I would go for walks after my parents went to sleep. It was just a way to lose myself in my thoughts, which was one of my favorite things at the time. And the night that this weird story happened, I was just on one of my regular late-night walks. I can't tell you how long I'd been out walking, lost deep in my thoughts, when I began hearing a strange noise outside. It was really hard to make out what the noise was, but I would sometimes hear it coming from different areas. I didn't get scared, however. I was just intrigued by whatever the strange noise could have been. But even as I kept walking and hearing these things, I did little to actually find out what was going on. I hadn't been out in the country very long, and I wasn't really used to the weird sounds that were out there. And I pretty much knew this too. So I just continued doing my thing, walking along. But then I heard a really weird shrieking noise, and when I did, I of course turned around to look in that direction. And when I did, I saw the scariest thing I ever seen in my life. There was this large, shadowy figure standing in the woods. That would have been frightening enough, but the thing actually had red, glowing eyes as well. Plus it seemed like they were looking right at me. I would like to think in retrospect I would have turned and ran away. But I thought I was seeing something that not many people would ever have a chance to see, and I wanted to take it all in, even though I was terrified. However, a few seconds after I saw it, the red eyes disappeared. Then suddenly the shadowy figure was gone too. It was at that point that I did get scared, and I turned and ran away, wanting to get back home after this weird experience. It wasn't until months later that I discovered the legend of the Mothman that was in the West Virginia area that we lived in. My mom never knew about the Mothman, but she remembered the collapse of the Silver Bridge very well. We lived in that area, and the fact that I saw something that had been described decades earlier was fascinating, but really scary. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. Hope everyone's had a good week. Mine's been a little rough, as it seems to always be. I'm still hoping I'm gonna get things going in a good direction though, so thank you all for sticking with me through all that. I'm trying to get on schedule, and I think eventually I'll do it. I just really right now I'm a little weirded out by what may happen next. I hope nothing. Just hope next week goes very smooth. But your country video comes up on Friday instead of Wednesday this week. We will have another one on Wednesday. Even though there's been internet problems here, I've still been able to work on videos. Normally I post them on the day that I finish them, but I thought it might be a good idea to have a few on deck, you know? I do have an abandoned building video, which will be coming up around soon. Other than that, I hope you're doing alright. Leave a comment for me, like the video if you enjoyed it, and share it with somebody. And if you have an original story, my email address is in the description. But most importantly, please don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a killer orange cat might be hiding. Good night.